What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and this is my live stream for Friday, April 16th, 2021. I think this is going to be episode 16 for the 2021 season. And as the title said, I am going to be sharing some thoughts on Canon's newly pre-announced EOS R3, the RF100 f2.8L, and the 400 and 600 RF millimeter RF f2.8 and f4L lenses. Um, Before I dive into that, I want to just throw this out there. So in previous videos, I have talked about a noise issue that comes up or that you can run into using Rode's video or wireless Go, using Rode's wireless Go transmitter and receiver, or specifically the receiver, hooked up to USB to charge while you're trying to record from it. And I had a question on what USB power supplies were sort of compatible with it. And the two that I have found that I've not had problems with are a 4-port Anchor power port, little brick kind of charger, and an 18-watt Apple iPad USB Type-C charger. And I want to say, in addition to that 18-watt, the Apple 5-watt iPhone chargers, but I don't have any of those handy to test. But generally, Apple's USB chargers tend to be very high quality, produce very little noise on the wires, and they don't, as far as I know, have had or don't have the interference or the USB data noise issues if you're looking for a charger. So with that said, I'm going to just dive right into talking about the Canon announcements, and this will probably be pretty short. So first off on the list is the announced Canon EOS R3. Now, I'm not at all sure why Canon chose to call this the R3 instead of the R1, except that maybe they do in fact have an even more insane or capable, or however you want to put it, camera coming down the road in the next, say, 12 to 18 months, and replacing the R1 with a new R1 in that short of a time span would maybe not be an ideal operation. I've seen a lot of people discussing how Canon doesn't want it to interfere, the branding to interfere with the 1DX. So the 1DX is still the flagship Canon DSLR, and the R3 isn't the new flagship camera. Uh, I mean, I guess that's entirely possible. It sounds good on first blush, but to me, if you're going with the argument that one, which is, this is what Canon has historically done, EOS 1 is the top of the line camera. The D or whatever is the indicator of the it's the indicator of what the camera is. So, when it was film cameras, it was just EOS 1, and they actually just stuck a letter on the end. There was a 1N, a 1RS, a 1V, as it evolved. When they went digital, it became EOS 1D and 1DS in the early days, and when the 1D and 1DS lines were kind of unified into a single 1D line, it became the 1DX. But EOS 1 was the flagship camera. Now, Canon has said that they're going forward, they won't be producing more new DSLR models unless the market demands that, a new DSLR model. And right now, that doesn't seem to be the case for the market. The market seems to want to go to mirrorless, and quite honestly, given the performance of the EOS R5, the EOS R6, the Sony A1, those cameras, and even Nikon Z series cameras, it's hard for me to say that the market is wrong, and they really do need to keep making DSLRs because they're doing something that you can't do in a mirrorless camera. Really, the only advantage that you're getting now with a DSLR, as far as I can see, is a little bit more battery life, and I'm not even sure how big of a deal that is, because basically I get a couple of days, as long as you get a day's worth of shooting on a battery. That's something that I won't say, who cares, but it's become something that's an entirely manageable type operation, to have a set of batteries and a set of batteries you recharge, and flip between the two. So I'm not quite sure where Canon's going, why they chose to go R3, unless potentially they're going to go back to the distinction between like a sports camera and a studio camera. And so, instead of having a 45 or 50 megapixel camera that's shooting 30 frames a second, maybe this isn't going to be such an unreasonably high, I would say, resolution, and to have that frame rate. So going through the press release, of course, there's not an awful lot to talk about the camera. Going through the press release, it's full frame. They say that. It's got a stacked CMOS, a back illuminated stacked CMOS sensor, which I know the people out there that are super interested in like the technology better or more than, or they care about the technology more than they care about what they're doing with the technology and making pictures, are going to be thrilled. I have seen people say things like, I will never buy another Canon camera until they use back illuminated sensors. And I don't get that, because the sensor isn't the picture is the picture. And for example, the R5, which as far as I know, isn't backside illuminated, does really well. In fact, it's got class-leading performance compared to anything that's approximately the same resolution in most metrics that are relevant, or that sensor size is relevant to. But anyway, backside illumination, it does help. It may, at least it helps with small pixels. With big pixels, like a 1DX size sensor or class sensor with a 20 megapixels, backside illumination is not really important at all. The pixels are so big that the backside illumination really doesn't improve the anything going on. It's not necessary from a image quality or light capture perspective. It can have an impact in stacking the sensor. So stacking means that essentially that there's a piece of silicon that's the sensor, and then attached to the back of it is the piece of silicon that's the processor, for example. So that's what Canon implies they're doing here. They're going to have the processor. Sony's been doing this, but Canon's implying that this is what's going on here. So the processing and the sensor is going to be in one package, with the sensor on one side and the processor glued to the back of it, with high-speed interconnects in between. Of course, this is why Sony went with it. It makes it much easier. You have way shorter distances between the processor and the sensor, and it makes it much easier to have very high-speed interconnects, which give you the ability to read the sensor out faster. And that's basically what Canon's touting as the benefits, which are 30 frames per second with electronic shutter, with less rolling shutter distortion than what's maybe what's happening in the R5 or what's happening currently. But they're actually saying that, and this is a place where Canon's situation is slightly different from maybe Sony's, is they have to be able to read the sensor out fast enough to do the live view and dual pixel AF. Whereas, because Sony's still using embedded phase points, or Sony uses embedded phase points, the phase points can be read out simultaneously, or they're not image forming, so they're not part of something that has to be read out with the image forming information. So there may be the possibility, say, in a Sony camera, to read the image and AF information sort of simultaneously, where that might be a bit more tricky or difficult with the dual pixel, or maybe not. My camera is absolutely not happy tonight. I apologize for all the jankiness. I have no idea why it keeps dropping out the way it is. So moving on, Canon's talking about new deep learning, more stuff, and the ability for the autofocus system to recognize new subjects. So currently, Canon cameras recognize people and people's eyes, dogs, cats, and birds. There's certainly been a lot of people who have been asking for more stuff in the wildlife vein. I feel like, what might actually be sort of preferable, if you were asking me, is to somehow see if they can't make it where we can train the cameras with software on our computer to learn something. Even if my training went back to Canon to help improve cameras in general, being able to teach my camera to focus on alligators or snakes or bears or whatever, to me would be helpful or beneficial. But this is one of those places when you start getting into really camera. This is one of those places where, hang on just a minute. This is one of those places where when you start getting into AI-driven autofocus stuff, machine learning based autofocus, that you start running into, I won't say problems, but you start running into, there's a limit to what the camera is trained on, and what it's necessarily trained on isn't inherently going to be what it's going to be used for. So they also talk about the electronic viewfinder and eye control AF2, which this brings back a technology that Canon introduced in late 90s, early 2000s, which is where there's a sensor in the viewfinder that's looking at where you're looking as you look in the viewfinder, and it uses where you're looking to position the tracking autofocus stuff. I believe in the 90s when this was being done, we were talking like 7 or 8 AF points. I have no idea how reliable it was, and I know it had problems if you were wearing sunglasses, especially polarized ones. How useful this is going to be now is an open question. It will certainly be interesting to see if Canon can actually make it reliable and effective and have it so that you can just keep looking at the thing in the frame that it's trying to track and use that as feedback into the tracking system, the tracking algorithm. That could be certainly really useful in expanding capabilities of what do I want to say? Expanding capabilities of subject matter without necessarily having the same kind of having to train every last detail in machine learning and then program it into the autofocus system. So, if you can keep your eye on part of the, say, a cheetah running, for example, if you can keep your eye where you're looking at it in the frame, and that can be fed back into, say, look for this color or look for this pattern, or follow this thing, you know, the camera's tracking it, but you're also tracking it with your eye. Therefore, it reinforces what it needs to track. That could certainly be useful. Now, I have no idea if that's going to be a capability that actually makes it to the camera or not, but they are claiming that it's going to have IAF, or whatever they call it, eye control AF. So, you know, that'll be interesting to see how that plays out in a modern camera. Then the final thing is dust and weather sealing that's comparable to an EOS 1D class camera, but since this is basically, as far as I can tell from looking at the specs and looking at the pictures that they've published, an EOS 1D, just they're not calling it a 1D for some reason. There you go. You know, it is what it is. So obviously they haven't announced enough to make an awful lot of in-depth look at the camera from spec release. I feel like they talked about more. There was more to be gleaned from the EOS R5's announcement than there really is to be gleaned from the R3s. So moving on, we've got 3 lenses to kind of talk through briefly. First up on my list is the 100 millimeter f2.8 L Macro Is Usm. Obviously, it's the RF version of the 100 millimeter macro for the EF cameras. However, we have 2 reasonable improvements for the lens. So it's been said, I don't have a direct quote, but it's been said repeatedly in various interviews and reviews of stuff that Canon's objectives with their RF lenses is to sort of build on what the EF lenses could do, so have an improved focal range or an improved capability set, or make it smaller and lighter or something to that effect. In this case, the improvements are, I would say, twofold. First of all, they increased the maximum magnification by 40%. So instead of this being a 1-to-1 macro, a 1-to-1 magnification macro lens, it goes all the way to 1.4 to 1 or 1.4x magnification, which will probably be interesting for macro photographers. That's a 40% increase in magnification. That's not something necessarily to sneeze at. The second new feature is the introduction of spherical aberration control. And basically the idea is that you'll be able to dial in the how the bokeh will look in your images, you know, whether it'll be softer or harsher, which, you know, again, it's one of those things, I'm not sure how that actually plays out in practice, but it'll be interesting nonetheless. So obviously it's image stabilized. 5 stops is what the standard rating is. If you've got an R5, an R6, or well, an EOS R with a in-body image stabilizer, which at the present time is the R5 and R6, it does a combination of up to 8 stops. So, you know, pretty much in line with the 24 to 70 f2, the 70 to 200, I think maybe, and the 24 to 105. My experience with the 24 to 70 f2 and 8 stops of image stabilization is the image stabilizer can stabilize camera shake for shutter or for exposures that are longer than I can hold still enough to make a sharp exposure. So it's pretty darn impressive if you ask me, and this should be pretty reasonable. Hybrid IS again, so interesting thing when I was looking through stuff on image stabilization, at normal working distances, so like what you would have shooting a landscape or what you would have shooting a portrait or something like that, the dominant mode of shake is yaw and pitch, so this and this. And the whole point of the hybrid IS is at macro type magnifications, you start getting X and Y translation and rolls in a factor like all things, but it's more dominant in macro close focus stuff. So obviously the in-body stabilizer is necessary for roll correction because you have to actually turn the sensor itself. You can't just turn a lens element. That doesn't actually rotate the picture. However, the whole thing with hybrid IS is obviously it can do X and Y in addition to pitch and yaw, and so there's it is what it is. This also looks like it will be the first Canon RF lens or Canon lens to use dual focusing elements. They're advertising it as having dual nano USM. You don't need 2 nano USM motors to drive one focusing element. So you're talking about that implies to me 2 focusing elements, which is arguably one of the things that the linear focusing technology that USM or nano USM kind of, or I should say nano USM, linear focusing technology that modern RF lens or modern mirrorless lenses are using enables more easily is having multiple lens groups that can be moved for focusing. And obviously the benefit of that is you can correct more potential problems when you're focusing. So you can correct, for example, breathing or parafocal stability would be with zooming. So, but you can correct breathing, you can correct more of the aberrations that can occur when you're with moving elements to focus and so on and so forth. So that'll be interesting to see, I think. And then of course it has the customizable control ring that has been standard on RF lenses, except, and that brings me to the last two lenses, the 400 the 400 f2.8L and the 600 f4L, which Canon makes a big deal about how they're optically identical to their EF counterparts, and they have 5.5 stops instead of 5 stops of shake reduction, which of course is, again, that the hybrid camera synchronization, but not getting a huge boost. Of course, telephoto lenses, it's a different cup of tea compared to more normal or wide angle lenses. They do include the same 3 IS modes, so mode 1, 2, and 3. So mode 1 is stabilize everything, mode 2 is panning, and mode 3 is only stabilize the image when the shutter is open to take a picture. They're compatible with the RF teleconverters. I mean, obviously they better be. A 9-bladed round aperture and 2 focus presets. Why I'm sort of disappointed, I guess is the best way to put it, in the RF 400 2.8 and 600 f4 is they really feel to me like Canon, I don't want to say it's a stopgap. It really feels to me like Canon had a lot of spare parts for 400s and 600s sitting around. Now, bear in mind, they don't make an awful lot of these lenses to start with. We're talking 10 to 15,000 lenses, or on that scale, is a pretty reasonable estimate of how many 400 2.8s or 600 f4s that a company like Canon will make, or a company like Nikon or Sony will make. So we're not talking 50 or 60,000 lenses at, best case. We're talking, or worst case, we're talking 15, 20, 30, 15 to 20, maybe 25,000 lenses. Canon makes, I think, more than Nikon. Nikon makes about 10,000. So I could see Canon making, 15,000 would be a lot more than 10,000, that's 50% more lenses percentage-wise. What it really felt to me in looking at the pictures of the lenses is that Canon went, we've got these EF lenses in stock. We should just stick RF mount adapters on them. Now, I'm sure there's more to it than that, you know, and flash a new firmware on them or something like that. I'm sure there's more to it than that, but, and I could understand maybe not changing the optical formula, the 600 f4 Mark II and the 400 or Mark III and the 400-28 Mark III for EF in EF are really good lenses. Like, they're light, they're sharp, they perform well. They could perform a little better in my opinion, but they're not bad lenses. It's not like they needed to replace those lenses to get a competent product to put out there. That said, it really feels to me like they took the EF lenses, stuck RF mount adapters permanently mounted and slightly different colored on the back of the lens and said, these are our new RF lenses. So physically they look practically identical to the EF lenses, except for the silver mount on the back. The big one to me is I think the EF lenses don't have the tool focus presets, but you know, I could be wrong about that because I don't own either of them. But the thing that I've noticed quite obvious, or quite immediately looking at the lenses is, and looking at the press release is they are not advertising having an RF lens control ring. The lenses have a manual focus ring, they have the focus preset ring. There's no obvious RF control ring on the lens like there is on every other RF lens. Even the $200 50 f1.8 has a control ring. And I'm really wondering why, you know, if they're going to go through, spend the time, like, you know, even if they're not going to change the optical design, putting a control ring on the physical package would not really be that big of a, you know, that difficult. But it's kind of like, you know, comparing the RF lens to the EF lens, it's kind of like the lens is an EF lens that they just changed the bare minimum to make it native RF. So maybe the switch stuff, but that's a module that they can put into the standard package. The electronics, you know, the controller or whatever, obviously that's, again, not a major engineering effort to change. And of course the mount, but if you look at what they've done, it looks like they just built a specialized mount adapter that sticks on the end of the lens, and you get a big silver chunk on the back of the lens that, quite honestly, I'm not enamored with the silver RF mount look. I think Canon's lenses, on the shorter lenses where it's just basically a silver band, it doesn't look bad to me, but on the 400 and 600, it's I think excessive. Now, I'm not saying these aren't going to be good lenses. They're going to be at least as good as their EF counterparts, and the EF lenses are good lenses. You know, that's hard to argue that they're not good lenses. But I just feel like, I don't even want to say that Canon rushed it, because honestly, I don't see how it would have, I don't see that it would have taken that much longer to put a control ring and make some new housings. Because that's really what we're talking about, is a housing. In fact, that's interesting because I don't remember Canon talking about autofocus motors on those. In fact, let me look. We'll just look at the 400-28. Yeah, they look like they're probably using the same I mean, they're not saying anything, but it's like looks like they're probably using the same ring USM motor that the current EF lenses use. So they're not nano USM, they're not linear focus drive or something like that. You know, it's interesting. I would be interested to see if Canon ends up. So the real question looking at the telephotos to me is actually what comes with the 500. What are they going to do with that? They didn't replace the 500 the EF 500 f4L second generation. They didn't do a third generation of that lens. They did a third generation 400 and 600, but not the 500 and not the 800. And so what we might see, what might be going on here, is the 400 and 600 were big development costs. They were only 2 years old. They were released in 2018, if I remember correctly, early 2018, something like that. So completely redoing them now would be a huge cost on a lens that just got re-released. So the interesting thing will be to see what they do with the 500 f4, the 300 2.8, and the 800 5.6, which we know are going to be coming at some point, is native RF lenses, because all three of those lenses, the EF lens designs are old enough that we would be starting to get to the point where we'd be talking about, like a new design would be relevant. It's not like, well, we just did this last year. It's good. Let's do what we need to do to make it native RF, but not completely redesign the lens from scratch. Whereas like the 500, the 800, and the 300 fall into a category where you start talking about, and the 200 to 400. I'm really interested to see what Canon does with the 200 400, because keeping with the expanding capabilities type thing, if Canon makes the 200 400 like a 200 to 500 f4 with a built-in 1.4 teleconverter, that would be a super high priority. Well, I won't say super high priority, but a high priority for moving into a big prime zoom, a big white lens, a great white lens. For me, instead of trying to figure out which of the primes that I'm not quite, like I've shot with a 600, I've shot with a 500. A 500 f4 does get me some stuff over, say, the 100 to 500 zoom, but it also gets a lot more weight. So it's kind of like with the way I shoot and what I do, it's a great white lens has always been one of those things where it's like, I'd love to have one, but I've never been able to justify the cost because the other factors involved weren't big enough or significant enough for me to really like, okay, this is really worth it. But a 200 to 500 f4 with a teleconverter built in, that might be in that park of where I'm going. This is the big white lens that I finally need to have, kind of thing. But anyway, like I said, it'd be interesting to see what they end up doing with the 500 when that gets announced and comes out. I have no idea when that's going to happen, but I'm 100% certain that Canon isn't going to go into the RF world with a 400 2.8 and a 600 f4, and that's it. The 200 to 400s are way too popular for like sports photographers. Even some landscape, or not landscape, wildlife photographers really like those lenses because you can pull back and you can punch in, and they offer a lot of flexibility. And I just don't see Canon not doing the, complete lens line, complete system with the RF cameras or lenses, as opposed to sort of going, well, you can still kind of still buy these the EF lenses. Like I think they're going to replace, everything's going to get replaced sooner rather than later, or sooner or later. Just but what they do is going to be the open question in my mind. So anyway, I'm going to wrap things up there. If you made it this far, thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, please smash that like button, consider subscribing, you know, all that normal stuff that people say at the end of videos. Again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.